Friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we are studying Daf Kuf Mem Ches of Masechta Shabbis, Daf 148. An overview before we begin. Setting a broken limb in place. It sounds uncomfortable, right? And then we get into all sorts of other things, but after that we get into the sugya of loaning a loaf of bread, which is actually kind of interesting. There's an interesting question about ribis, interest, which we will get to. Interesting little question. And then we get into loans on Yom Tif. Are you allowed to, what happens if you loan something on Yom Tif? Can you claim it afterwards? Being makdish an animal on Yom Tif. Can you do that? That and more on Daf Kuf Mem Ches of Masechta Shabbos. Friends, Daf Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Bey's last line of the page, Vein Machzirin Es HaShever, that we do not set a broken limb on Shabbos. Amar Rav Chana Bagdad Ta'a Amar Shmuel. Says Rav Chanan from Baghdad in the name of Shmuel. Shmuel was in Narda. Narda, if I'm not mistaken, was somewhat close to Baghdad. Halacha, assuming that they're the same assuming that Baghdad is the same Baghdad that was then, at least geographically. Halacha Machzirin Es HaShever. So Rav Chanan Bagdata says in the name of Shmuel that you actually are allowed to set a broken limb on Shabbos. Rabbi Bar Chana ikla lefumpedisa. Rabbi Bar Chana visited Pumpedisa. Lo al lepirke dit Rav Yehuda, and he did not go to Rav Yehuda's class. Shadre le'ada dayala. So Rav Yehuda sent Ada Dayala Amle Zilgarbe. So Rav Yehuda said to Ada Dayala, his right-hand man person, and he said, hey, go get Rabba Bar Chana. Azil Garbe. So Ada Dayala went and he chapped Rabba Bar Chana. Also Ashkeche de Kadarish in Machzirnes HaShever. So when Rabbi Bar Chana got to the Beis HaMedrash, he heard that Rav Yehuda was saying, like the Mishnah says, that you are not permitted to set a broken limb on Shabbos. Amar le, to which Rabbi Bar Chana said to Rav Yehuda, Hachi Amar Rav Chana Bagdata, that Rav Chana Bagdata said the following, Amar Shmuel, in the name of Shmuel, Halacha Machzirin Es HaShever. So Rabbi Bar Chana said to Rav Yochanan that Chana Bagdata said in the name of Shmuel that you actually are permitted to set a limb on Shabbos. Amar le, Rav Yehuda said to Rabbi Bar Chana, Hachana didan, v'ashmuel didan, v'lo shmieli, v'la bedina geravtich. Rav Yehuda was amazed. He said, wow. Right? Meaning, because what happened? Rabbi Bar Chana, okay, Rav Yehuda said, like our Mishnah, that you're not allowed to set a broken limb. Rabbi Bar Chana, who came from Eretz Yisrael, of course, Rabbi Bar Chana is always quoting Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Bar Chana came from Eretz Yisrael. He's now in Bavel. He's in Pumpedisa. Rav Yehuda is the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumpedisa. Rav Yehuda is saying that, like our Mishnah, that you're not allowed to set a broken limb on Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Bar Chana comes, and who's he quoting? He's not quoting Rabbi Yochanan from Eretz Yisrael that it would make sense that Rabbi Yehuda didn't know because Rabbi Yehuda is in Bavel and Rabbi Yochanan is in Eretz Yisrael. Instead, Rabbi Bar Chana comes and he says, by the way, Rav Chana Bagdata, Rav Chana from Baghdad says in the name of Shmuel, who's in Narda, that you actually are allowed to set a broken limb. To which Rav Yehuda says, oh my goodness, that's insane. Rav Chana's from Bavel, Shmuel's from Bavel, and yet you from Eretz Yisrael are telling me what they said. Isn't it a very good thing that I had Ada Dayala go and collect you so that you can teach this? Misha Nifrika Yado Chule. Somebody whose whose arm got dislocated. That also sounds very uncomfortable. Rav Avya Yosef, comment of Yosef. Rav Avya was sitting before Rav Yosef, Shanya Leyade, and sure enough, his arm got dislocated. Yikes. So Rav Avya said, I guess Rav Avya was interested in resetting his, fixing his dislocated arm. So he said to Rav Yosef, hey Rav Yosef, am I allowed to do like this on Shabbos? And Rav Yosef said, no, you're not allowed to do like that. And then he goes, what about like this? Amalei Aser. Rav said, no, you're not allowed to do that fancy move either. And while he kept on asking Rav Yosef, well, maybe I can do like this, and he kept on trying to do these funny little different maneuvers to get his limb back in place, and saying, hey, Rav Yosef, can I do that? And he kept on saying no, until finally one of them worked, and all done. Problem solved, limb is back in place. And then Rav Yosef said, by the way, Rav Yosef said to Rav Avia, by the way, what was even your question? It's a beferish Mishnah. Tanaan, we learned in the Mishnah, Misha nifrika yado, somebody whose hand got dislocated, or raglo, or epis, his leg, lo yitzfrein b'tzonin, you should not move them around, quickly, I guess, or in cold water. Aval rochitz kedarko, but he can wash his arm, regularly. And if it gets back into place, it gets back into place. So Amalei, so Rav Avi said to Rav Yosef, v'lo Tanaan, but do we not also learn in the same Mishnah, ein machzirin es hashever, that you're not allowed to set a broken limb? And yet Rav Chana Bagdata says in the name of Shmuel, halachim machzirin es hashever, that you actually are allowed to set a broken limb. So therefore, said Rav Avi, I thought maybe there was also a similar situation with the dislocated limbs. Maybe you could also put those back in place. Amalei kulu b'chada machisa michisanu. So Rav Yosef says to Rav Avia, what, are they all woven with the same garment? Kielu, just because something was, turned out differently in one place doesn't mean that every place is different. That where we have a statement that says that it's different than what the Mishnah says, so it's different. But over here we don't have such a statement, so there's no reason to assume that anything is different than the Mishnah, and therefore you should not be relocating your dislocated limb. Hadran alach chavis. We will come back to Perek Chavis. So interestingly, Shmuel is Lemaisa and Amora, right? And he seems to be saying for some reason the opposite of what the Mishnah is saying. We see sometimes that Rav is a Tana and he can argue. I feel like maybe we saw somewhere that Shmuel can also argue, but I can't say that for sure. But it's definitely interesting that he's saying the opposite of what the Mishnah says. Friends, can we move on to Perek Shoel? So a person on Shabbos is allowed to ask his friend for wine or for oil, but he has to specifically say what? Shoel. He has to use the lesson of she'ela, to borrow, as opposed to v'vad shelo yomer lo halveni. As long as he doesn't say, will you loan me wine or oil? Right? A loan, a stam loan, is for 30 days. Right? It's more long term. And the concern is that if Reuven goes over to Shimon and he says, hey Shimon, can you loan me a bottle of wine, which stam hava is for 30 days, Shimon might say sure, and then he'll go and write it down so that he will remember that he lent a bottle of wine to Reuven. We don't want him to write it down, so if we say, hey, avoid using a lashon of halva, of a loan, which is more long-term, that he might write it down, rather say she'ela, borrow it, which is more short-term, and Shimon's going to have no reason to write it down, he'll get it back the next day, l'maaseh. And similarly, if Sarah wants to borrow from Rivka a loaf of bread, also she shouldn't say, can you loan me a loaf of bread, which implies that she'll return it in 30 days. Rather, she should say, can I borrow a loaf of bread, implying that she will return it shortly. Now, if Shimon doesn't believe that Reuven is really going to return the bottle of wine, so Shimon can request that Reuven leave his talis by him, so that Reuven's going to come back to retrieve his talis, and when Reuven comes back to retrieve the talis, they'll, work out some kind of cheshbon with how to make sure that Shimon gets back either his wine or money. Similarly, when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, and, a certain fellow did not yet get his Korban Pesach, and now it's Erev Pesach, it's Shabbos. This guy needs a Korban Pesach, so what does he do? So, Erev Pesach b'Yushalayim shchalios b'Shabbos maniach taliso etzlo v'notel es pischo v'osei mochesh m'lachar Yom Tov. So what can happen is Reuven needs a Korban Pesach. He can go to Shimon's house and say, hey Shimon, can you give me a sheep? I need it for my Korban Pesach. And the same thing. Shimon can give to Reuven the sheep, and Reuven can leave his talis over there, and then after Yom Tov, which I believe Rashi says, Kilu on Kilu today's Shabbos, well then Sunday is going to be the first day of Yom Tov. The day after that, on Chol HaMoed, I think, they can make it back up. Where did I see that? Yeah, exactly. Liyom Shlishi, yeah. So I believe that would probably be the first day of Chol Hamoed. Then they can work out the details of how Shimon's going to get paid back for that sheep. Says the Gemara, Rava bar Rav Chanan la'Abaye, says Rava bar Rav Chanan to Abaye, Maishna hashileni, Maishna halveni. What's the difference if Reuven says the Lashon she'ela, or if he says the Lashon halva'a? Amar le, so Abaye answers Rava bar Rav Chanan, Hashileni lo asi l'michtav, halveni asi l'michtav. He said, well, Lashon she'ela, just a regular borrowing, Shimon, we're not concerned Shimon's going to write it down. However, if Reuven says, will you love it malve halva'a, will you do a halva'a? Well, then Shimon might write it down so that he doesn't forget that he lent the bottle of wine. I'll read that again. So Rava bar Rav Chanan asks Abaye, but sometimes during the week, sometimes Reuven should really say halveni, will you lend me for a minimum of 30 days? Yet Reuven will say during the week, hashileni v'lo kapid ilave, and Shimon is not going to be so mocked, but he realizes like, oh, okay, he means halveni and he's saying hashileni. And what will Shimon do if it's during a week? Imagine it's Sunday. Reuven comes to Shimon on a Sunday. He says, Shimon, will you lend me a bottle of wine? He says she'ela. But really, Shimon understands that he really means halva'a. So he goes and he writes it down. So what do we see? That we have a situation where Reuven said the lashon she'ela, and Shimon's writing it down anyways because he's understanding it to mean halva'a. So b'Shabbos nam yasi l'michtav, can't we assume that the same thing is equally relevant for Shabbos? That Reuven shows up at Shimon's door, he says, can you be mash'il me a bottle of wine, lashon she'ela, and Shimon says, yeah, sure, no problem. But he's still, Shimon, aren't we concerned Shimon's going to understand it as if he said halva'a, and he's going to write it down anyways, even though he said she'ela? Amalei, Abaye responds, b'Shabbos, Kevin de hashileni hu deshaule rabbanon halveni lo shaule. Since on Shabbos the rabbi specifically allowed Reuven to say hashileni but not to say halveni, so therefore when Reuven shows up at Shimon's door and he says hashileni, it's clear that he's doing it to be in line with what the rabbi said. Minkra milsav lo asi l'michtav. It's clear that what's going on here is that Reuven is davka asking for the bottle of wine in the permitted way, lashon she'ela, which will be short term, and it's not a halva'a. And Shimon will be, yeah man, enjoy your bottle of wine, let's talk tomorrow. Amalei Rava bar Rav Chanan la'Abaye, says Rava bar Rav Chanan to Abaye, Michdei, let us see. Amar Rabbanan, the rabbi said, Kol milei de Yom Tiv kamadev shel shanuye mishaninon. When it comes to things on Yom Tiv, as long, as much as we could try to do things different, we do. Meaning, if I understand correctly, what this means is that, for example, on Yom Tov, you're allowed to do malacha if it's a tzarech ochel nefesh, right? But still, even these malachas that you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, the tzarech ochel nefesh, you should still try to do it differently. Even though it's mutter, you should still at least try to do it differently. Well, if that's the case, haninashi demayon chatzbayu, well, if, right, these women that are going to fill up their buckets with water, right, maya, with water, my time alone mishaninon. Why are they just filling up their buckets regularly? Shouldn't they do something different? Amalei, so Abaye says to Rav Chanan to Rava bar Rav Chanan, mishum de le'evshar. What can they possibly do differently? What should they do? Demalion b'chadz baraba, demalion b'chadz bazuta. What if generally they fill up large buckets? So should they fill up smaller buckets? Well, they're going to have to make more trips. We don't want them to make more trips on Yom Tiv. If they normally fill up smaller buckets, so should we say do it differently on Yom Tiv and fill up larger buckets? Well, then you're going to make it harder for them, and they're going to have to do, it's going to be more of a burden on Yom Tiv. Certainly we don't want that either. Nifro Sudra, should we say that you should take some kind of cloth and cover your buckets? Normally the buckets would be uncovered, but as to make a hecker, to do it differently, take maybe a piece of cloth, a towel, and cover it. Well, if that's the case, then the cloth is going to get wet and they'll wring it out. We don't want them doing that either. Should they cover it with some kind of cover and tie down the cover? Right? Well, sometimes the rope, the string or whatever that they use to tie down the cover, it might break. And then they might go and make a kesher shakayama, a knot to fix it. And we don't want that either. Therefore they say, just leave them alone. Let them fill up their water however they want. There isn't really a good way for them to do it differently that wouldn't end up leading to other unintended negative consequences. V'amle Rava bar Rav Chanan le'Abaye, and says Rava bar Rav Chanan to Abaye, Tanaan, we learn in the Mishnah in Beitza, lo mesapkin, v'lo metapchin, v'lo mirakdin. We do not clap, and we do not bang against our hearts, and we do not dance. We wouldn't want any of that happening on Yom Tif. No clapping, no knocking on your heart, and no dancing. Yet we see that people are doing these terrible things. People are clapping. People are being leibedik, right? Misameach, they're dancing. So Abaye says, and according to you, Rava bar Rav Chanan, Hado Amar Rabba. It says Rava. The Gilon changes it to Rabba, even though we had it the other day in the name of Rava. For some reason, I want to say Rabba because it's a dialogue between Abaye, and it just feels like it might be more of a dialogue between him and his Rebbe versus him and his contemporary. Hado Amar Rabba, that which Rabba says, Lo leisav inish apuma de lechayaya. Right, Rabba says that a person should not sit by the entrance to the mavui. Dilma migander lechefetz vasili isuye, because maybe some kind of object will roll by and it'll go and chop the object from Rishus HaRabim to where he's sitting in Rishus HaYachid by the entrance to the mavui. Yet we see that people are going and taking their buckets, flipping them over and sitting on them right by the edge of the mavui. So, meaning, Rava bar Rav Chanan is asking, how come the Mishnah says that people shouldn't be clapping, people shouldn't be dancing? Yet we see people are clapping and dancing. Right? To which Abaye says, well, there are other things also. For example, you shouldn't take a bucket and you shouldn't go and sit right at the edge of the mavui. But people sit at the edge of the mavui. Listen to this, friends. You guys listening? We don't say anything to them. Ela hanach li Yisrael, leave the Yidden alone. Mutav shu shogegin v'ayu mazidin. Better that they should do this by accident than to do it on purpose. What it sounds like to me is like, if you tell people not to dance and clap on Yom Tif, they're going to dance and clap on Yom Tif anyways. So better let them dance and clap by accident than to tell them that you're not allowed to do it and that they're going to do it anyways, they're going to dance and clap on purpose. Don't tell these people not to go sit by the edge of the mavui, they're going to sit by the edge of the mavui. So, Hanach li Yisrael mutav shu shogegin v'al yuhu mezidin. Very, very interesting, right? So Rava bar Rav Chanan thought that maybe Abaye was saying that you could say this by dinim d'Rabbanan, like a mavui, like clapping, like dancing. These are dinim d'Rabbanan. They're not isurei d'oraisa. But you wouldn't say, right, mutav shu shogegin v'al yuhu mezidin by d'oraisa. Velohi, but it's not true. Lo shna b'd'Rabbanan v'lo shna b'd'oraisa. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter if it's mid'Rabbanan. It doesn't matter if it's mid'oraisa. Deha Tosefes Yom Kippurim d'Oraisa. Adding on to Yom Kippur's mid'oraisa. Right? We always add on a shtickle to Yom Kippur before it starts. We do Tosefes Yom Kippur a little bit. You stop eating a little bit before Yom Kippur starts. V'kach azinan. And yet we see that people eat and drink until the mamash gets dark on Erev Yom Kippur, and we don't say anything to them. Rather, Hanachloyen li Yisrael mutav shu shogegun va'al yuhu mezidin. So now the Gemara has an interesting shaila about ribbis. You guys ready for that? About interest. So the Mishnah said, "V'chen isha mechaverta kikarus." So we said that a woman should not. So meaning, if a woman is borrowing from her friend a loaf of bread on Shabbos, so she should ask with a lashon she'ela, not with a lashon of halva'ah, because halva'ah is at least minimum 30 days, and therefore her friend might write that down, and we don't want that to happen. So now look what the Gemara asks. So does that imply that on Shabbos we don't want you to use the lashon halva'ah because we don't want anybody writing anything down, implying that during the week there's nothing to worry about, right? Sarah can go over to Rivka and she could say, "Hey, Rivka, can you lend me can I loan a loaf of bread for 30 days?" And if it's during the week, Rivka will say, "No problem." She'll get out her ledger, she'll write it down. Sarah owes me a loaf of bread, and then she'll remember in 30 days to ask for it back. But then it would sound like this Mishnah is not like Hillel's opinion. What does Hillel say? Hillel would say, Lo salve isha kikar lachaverta. Hillel says that a woman should not lend a loaf of bread to her friend for an extended period of time. unless she first translates the cost of the loaf of bread into money. Because what if the price of wheat goes up? Then it will end up being interest. Meaning, let's say Rivka lends a loaf of bread to Sarah. Now at the time, the price of a loaf of bread is $1. Now 30 days later, the price of wheat went up, and now the price of a loaf of bread is $2. Well, if Sarah now comes back and gives Rivka back the loaf of bread, well, basically she took a value of $1 and she's returning a value of $2, which means that Rivka is receiving more than she lent, and that would be interest, and we don't want that. So Hillel is saying that you cannot loan bread because we're concerned that when you return the bread, maybe the price of wheat went up and there will be a problem of interest. Yet our Mishnah seems to be saying that the issue of loaning bread is really only on Shabbos. During the week it would be fine. What about interest? So afilu teime Hillel, you can even say that our Mishnah is in accordance with Hillel. Ha be'asur the kayetz dameh, ha be'asur the lo kayetz dameh. So it depends. If the price of bread is fixed, well then if the price of bread is fixed, well then, there's nothing to be concerned about. So when our Mishnah implies that during the week you would be allowed to loan bread, it's in a place where the price of bread is always going to be $1. So you can loan a loaf of bread, give back a loaf of bread in a month. You can assume that you borrowed a value of $1 and are returning a value of $1. But when Hillel is saying not to loan bread, that is in a place where the value of bread is not fixed and it can fluctuate, and therefore we have to be concerned that while maybe it was $1 when it was lent, it might be $2 when it was returned, in which case there's a question of interest. Isn't that very interesting? Oh gosh, I have a shtickle problem over here. The sun is coming in very stark now through the windows, and it's shining on my Gemara, which makes it very difficult to read and very distracting. So maybe I'm going to try to just read from the side. Hopefully that'll work. Oh gosh, wish me luck. So great. Just when we're getting into the hard part, the sun is driving me insane, but I don't really know of a different option. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to deal with it. So, Idmar, Havas Yom Tov. So we had said this. The Mishnah had said that, so if Reuven comes to borrow Epis, a bottle of wine, on maybe I'll even try it with the sun. Oh, it's going to be so annoying. Okay, so it'll be annoying. What do you want me to tell you? So if Reuven comes to borrow a bottle of wine from Shimon on Shabbos, so we said that if Shimon doesn't trust that Reuven is going to return it, well then Shimon can request that Reuven should just leave his talis with him, and then when Reuven comes to get his talis, so then they'll work out the details and get things back. So Idmar, it was stated, Avas Yom Tov, Rav Yosef Amar lo nitna li tava, Rabba Amar nitna li tava. Interesting. So it's Machlokas Rabba and Rav Yosef. What do you do with a loan on Yom Tov, right? Such as over here. Reuven is borrowing wine from Shimon, okay? Can Shimon claim this afterwards, right? After Yom Tov, can Shimon now go to Reuven and say, I lent you a bottle of wine, you got to return it to me. So Rav Yosef Amar lo nitna li tava. Rav Yosef says that Shimon would be unable to claim this bottle of wine from Reuven. The Amar nitna li tava, because if you say that Shimon would be able to claim this bottle of wine from Reuven, well, then we're concerned that Shimon might write it down so that he remembers to claim it. But if you just say that he's not allowed to claim it in any event, well, then he won't write it down. Rabba Amar nitna li tava. Rabba says that that Shimon would be allowed to claim this bottle of wine from Reuven. The Amar lo nitna, because if you say that Shimon cannot claim the bottle of wine from Reuven, well, lo yoev lei, well then Shimon's not going to give it to Reuven if he knows that he'll be unable to get it back. Which means that Shimon is then going to be preventing Reuven from being able to enjoy Yom Tov properly, because Shimon is not going to be giving Reuven a bottle of wine because he might never get it back. Now we're going to try to prove, either one way or the other for a little bit. So Tanaan, we learned in our Mishnah, So our Mishnah had said that if Shimon doesn't trust that Reuven is going to pay back, going to return his wine, so what can he do? So he can request that Reuven leaves his garment by Shimon, so that when Reuven comes back to get it, they can work out the details of getting back the wine. So what does that sound like to you guys? What does that sound like to you? Shimon's basically taking things into his own hands, right? Doesn't it sound like he's basically saying, well, it sounds like Rav Yosef, that you're unable to claim the wine, a havas yom tiv. Meaning, and that's why he's saying, look, I don't trust that Reuven is going to give you back this wine, therefore I'm going to take things into my own hands and have him leave the talis by me, right? So I understand like Rav Yosef that a havas yom tiv is unable to be claimed. That's why Shimon has to realize that he's going to be unable to claim the wine from Reuven. Therefore, he has to take things into his own hands and say, hey, Reuven, I want you to leave your talis by me so that I know that you'll come back to get the talis and we can figure out the details of getting back the wine as well. But if you're going to say like Rabbah that you are allowed to claim this havas yom tiv, no, so why does Shimon have to demand that Reuven leave his talis by him? Let him just keep his talis, let him take the wine, and if he doesn't return the wine, just take him to court. Come on. So Amar lo ba'ina deleikum bedina v'dayana. So Rabbi says, take him to court. Is that really your suggestion? That sounds like the biggest headache in the world, right? It's much easier to say, Reuven, leave your talis over here so I know you'll come back, rather than to say, you know what, let him keep his talis, take the wine, and if he doesn't actually return it, then I'll just go to court and hire judges and lawyers and all sorts of stuff like that. Sounds like a humongous headache. It's much easier for him to just say, even though technically speaking you could take him to court, it's much easier for him to say, hey, just leave your talis here. Masr Rav Idi bar Oven asks a kasha. This is an interesting situation. Hashoichet es apara v'chilka b'rosh Hashana. Okay, so this is a Mishnah in Shvius. This is a Mishnah in Shvius. Shvius, of course, talks about Shemitah. So now what happens is it was Shemitah, okay? Now the Shemitah year is over, and now it's Rosh Hashanah, meaning that the year after Shemitah is now beginning, okay? Fine. So now it's Rosh Hashanah, it's the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and you have a shochet, and the shochet has a slaughterer, and the shochet has a cow, and he shechts the cow. Now, obviously, a cow is very big, so he tells all of his, all of the friends and all of the neighbors. He says, "Look, I'm shechting a cow. Come and take whatever meat you want, and then just pay me back after Rosh Hashanah." Okay? So again, so a shochet is apara. So a shochet who shechts a cow on Rosh Hashanah, that is, for the year immediately following Shemitah. V'chilka b'Rosh Hashanah, right? And he then divided up the cow and he gave it out to the neighbors on Rosh Hashanah. Im haya chodesh me'ubar. Okay, so the assumption here is that, okay, so we, generally speaking, Rosh Hashanah is always 2 days, and it's always the first 2 days of Tishrei. Meaning, in general, when we have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh, it consists of the last day of the previous month and the first day of the next month. So, for example, Chodesh Elul, which is coming up in a few weeks, if I'm not mistaken, that's going to be a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, which means that the first day of Rosh Chodesh is going to be the last day of Av, and the second day of Rosh Chodesh is going to be the first day of Elul. However, it is different when it comes to Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is 2 days, but it's the first 2 days of Tishrei. However, in this Mishnah, they are assuming that Rosh Hashanah would be the same exact thing, which means that if Elul had 30 days, i.e. it was a full month, well then there would be 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, the first day being the last day of Elul, and the second day of Rosh Hashanah being the actual first day of the new year. Okay? So, we're saying, Im haya chodesh me'ubar. So if Elul was 30 days, it was a full month, so then that means that the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which is when this cow is being shechted and divided up, is really the last day of Shemitah. Now, there's a halacha that on Shemitah all loans are forgiven, which means that this sucker is shechting a cow and giving meat to all of his neighbors on the last day of Shemitah. Now, there's also another thing, is that these loans that get forgiven on Shemitah, they get forgiven at the end of Shemitah. I.e., this sucker is mamish shechting the cow, dividing it up to all of the neighbors, saying, hey guys, after Rosh Hashanah I expect that you're going to pay me back, but he's mamish doing this on the last day of Shemitah, And on the last day of Shemitah is when all loans are forgiven, which means that nobody's actually going to have to pay him back, right? So Imaya Chodesh Me'ubar, if Elul was a complete month, well then Shemitah is basically going to forgive the loans and nobody's going to have to pay him back. V'im lav eino mishamet. However, if Elul was 29 days, which means that there's only one day of Rosh Hashanah, and that one day is the first day of the next year, and that is when this is happening. So basically, he's shechting this cow on the first day of the next year, which is after Shemitah already. Well then, einu mishamet. Well then, Shemitah, of course, is not going to forgive this loan because Shemitah is already over, right? The Rosh Hashanah, if Elul was only 29 days, that means that Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the next year, and when he shechs the cow and gives it to his friends and say, hey, I want you guys to pay me back. Well, they certainly have to pay him back. Now, here we go. V'ilo nitna litaba. Now, if, like Rav Yosef, any halva'a that you do on Yom Tiv, you are unable to claim anyways, well then, what is the Mishnah even talking about, right? Meaning, the Mishnah is saying that this shochet is shechting the cow. He's then dividing up the meat and giving it to people as a loan and saying that I expect that you guys are going to pay me afterwards. And we're saying, well, it happens to be that if it's the last day of Shemitah, well then Shemitah is going to go and forgive this loan anyways. Which clearly means that we're talking about a loan that is able to be collected, and we're saying that comes Shemitah, and it's actually going to forgive this loan. So it certainly sounds like a loan that takes place on Yom Tiv is a real loan and is able to be collected, but unfortunately for this guy, because it's the last day of Shemitah, his loan is going to be forgiven. Right? So v'ilo nitna litava, if loans that take place on Yom Tiv are unable to be collected anyways, they're not real loans, well then my mishamet, well then what does it mean that Shemitah is going to come and forgive his loan? Yom Tiv loans aren't real loans anyways. So it certainly sounds like Rabbah, who says that Yom Tiv loans are loans and they are able to be collected, and that is why Shemitah comes and we're saying that Shemitah is going to forgive the loan in this case. So the Gemara answers that for Rav Yosef, who says that Halvas Yom Tov is not able to be collected, so then what are we talking about? So Rav Yosef answers that, well, actually this is an interesting case because since it's the last day of Shemitah, i.e., it's clear that it's not really Rosh Hashanah. What's Rosh Hashanah? Meikar Adin, Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the new year. So we're celebrating 2 days of Rosh Hashanah this year because Elul had 30 days. So we say 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, right? The first day is going to be the last day of Elul. The second day of Rosh Hashanah is going to be the first day of Tishrei. Now, the fact of the matter is, Rosh Hashanah is really only the first day of Tishrei. It's not the last day of Elul. And therefore, sure, we celebrate Rosh Hashanah on the last day of Elul, and we celebrate 2 days of Rosh Hashanah this year, but the fact of the matter is, it's not really Yom Tiv. Right? And therefore, it's not really a Havas Yom Tiv. And because it's not really a Havas Yom Tiv, it's just a regular Halva'a. So that is why we're saying that in general, it would be a good loan and it would have to be paid back. However, because it is Shemitah is going to come and forgive the loan. Okay, so Rav Yosef was able to defend his position. Tashma miseifa. But now we're going to ask a kasha from the second part of this Mishnah, which was, Im lav enu mishamet, that if Elul is only 29 days, which means that Rosh Hashanah is 1 day, i.e., it's the only Rosh Hashanah is 1 day, and that 1 day is the first day of Tishrei, which means that the shochet is shechting this cow on the first day of Tishrei, mamish on Rosh Hashanah, and it's the new year, right? Okay, and we're saying enu mishamet. So if that's the case, well then of course, Shemitah has nothing to do with Rosh Hashanah. Shemitah is done. This is the first day of the new year, and certainly Shemitah is not going to forgive this loan because Shemitah is over. Okay? Now, Iyamad Bishlama Nidna Litava, so I understand if you say that a loan on Yom Tov is able to be claimed, right? Hainu Dikatani Enu Mishamet. That's why it's saying that there's no reason to assume that this loan that's taking place on Yom Tov is forgiven, and therefore he is going to be able to collect from all of his neighbors the next day and say, hey, I lent you guys meat on Yom Tiv, I want you to pay me back. Sounds like, right. Sounds like an argument for those who say that you're allowed to make a loan on Yom Tiv and you can collect it. But if you're going to say that you're unable to collect a loan that took place on Yom Tiv anyways, well then what does it mean that, he's going to be allowed to collect, right? Enu Mishamet, that Shemitah is not going to forgive it, i.e. that he's going to be allowed to collect it. No, he can't. According to Rav Yosef, you can't collect loans that took place on Yom Tiv. So what does it mean that, if Elul was only 29 days, which means that there's only one day of Rosh Hashanah, and that day is the first day of Tishrei, and we say that he's going to be able to collect the money from the people who took the meat? No, he can't. If you're saying like Rav Yosef, that a Havas Yom Tov you can't collect, well then why is the Mishnah saying that he's allowed to collect it? So the Gemara answers, the Yayiv le Shakil. So Rav Yosef will answer, no, it means that while sure, the Shochet will be unable to force people to pay him after Rosh Hashanah, however, if people want to pay him on their own, he would be allowed to accept that. Michlal de Reisha Yayiv le lo Shakil. Well, does that imply that then in the Reisha, when it was the last day of Shemitah, right? And we're saying that, that Shemitah would forgive the loan. Does that imply that if people wanted to pay him back, he would be unable to accept the money? So the Gemara answer is, well, yeah, kind of. Right? Reisha tzarich l'meimar le mishpat mishamit ani. Seifa lo tzarich l'meimar le mishamit ani. In the Reisha, if somebody of his own volition wanted to pay the shochet and say, hey, look, I want to pay you for the meat that I took, the shochet would have an obligation to say, thank you, that's very kind of you, but you should know you really don't have to pay me because it's Shemitah. Whereas in the Seifa, even though the shochet would be unable to force people to pay him, if people wanted to pay him, he could just collect the money without, having to say, hey, you really don't have to pay me back. Because after all, Shemitah is over, and if somebody wants to pay him, he can accept the money just like that. Tanaan, as we learn in the Mishnah, if somebody returns a loan, a debt to somebody on Shemitah, Yomar lo mishamit ani, right? So the lender has an obligation to say to the borrower, that's very kind of you to return the loan, but I'm forgiving it because it's Shemitah. Amar lo afal pichen yikabel mimenu. But if the borrower says, no, I know that I don't have to pay it back to you, but I want to pay it back to you, well then the lender can accept it at that point. Mishum shenemar, as the pasuk says, v'zed devar hashmita. This is the word of the Shemitah, meaning you have to verbally acknowledge the fact that you're unable to collect this loan. If the borrower says, I know, but I want to pay you back anyways, then you can collect the money. Wow. Okay, so if Yosef was able to defend himself, in his opinion, that you are unable to compel somebody to return a loan that happened during Yom Tiv. Rav Avya shakal mashkona. Rav Avya would take a mashkon. If he would lend somebody money on Shabbos or Yom Tiv, he would take a collateral. Rabba Bar Ula Myrim Yarume. Rabba Bar Ula would be a little tricky. He would lend something, and then the next day he would show up at the guy's house and sneakily kind of take something, and then all of a sudden they're kind of even, and until the guy pays him back, he's going to hold on to that thing that he chapped. Okay, said the Mishnah, v'chein Erev Pesach. And similarly on Erev Pesach, right, we said that if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, so Reuven can go to Shimon's house and say, hey Shimon, can you give me a sheep for a Korban Pesach, right? And then, Shimon can ask him for his talis. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, makdish on Pischo b'Shabbos v'chagigaso b'Yom Tiv. So it says Rabbi Yochanan, a person can be makdish a Korban Pesach on Shabbos and chagiga on Yom Tiv. Meaning, Korban Pesach, of course, we know that that's the offering that you bring, that you shecht on the 14th of Pesach, and you eat it at the Seder. So if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, you're allowed to, be makdish to say, hey, you little sheepy guy, you're going to be my Korban Pesach. Excited? And then also a chagiga on Yom Tiv. So there's a Korban Chagiga, which is that every single person or everybody who comes to be Ola Regel on Yom Tiv, so they have to bring a Korban Chagiga on the first day of Yom Tiv. So you can be makdish a Korban Chagiga on the first day of Yom Tiv. So let's say that our Mishnah Taka is a support for Rabbi Yochanan. How? Well, because it says V'chein Erev Pesach b'Yerushalayim shchalios b'Shabbos, that if it's Erev Pesach in Yerushalayim and it's Shabbos, maniach taliso etzlo v'noteles pischo v'osei mochesh b'nachar Yom Tiv. So Reuven can leave his talis by Shimon and take a sheep, and now he's got his Korban Pesach, and then after Yom Tiv, they figure out how, to pay back and stuff like that. So what do we see? That Reuven is coming to Shimon and being makdish his Korban Pesach dartin. So the Gemara says, no, it's not necessarily a proof. Maybe Reuven is not being makdish anything. So what's going on? Hachav Ma'askinon, here what are we talking about? B'mamana acherim imo al pischo. It's talking about where Shimon already had a chabura to be eating the korban pesach. A korban pesach, you have to be, invited. You have to be part of a group of people who are eating korban pesach. And Reuven didn't have a group of people to eat with. He knew that Shimon had a group, so he went over to Shimon's house. He says, "Hey, Shimon, can I join your group?" Now, Shimon and his group they already had a korban pesach. They already set it aside. They're already makdish it. Reuven is just coming to join the group, and they said, "Yeah, sure, join the group, but it costs a little bit of money. Leave your talis here. When you come back to get it, we'll figure out the financial stuff." But he's not actually being makdish to korban pesach. The group had already been makdish to korban pesach. To make kari mikadesh v'kai, it was already been makdish. Yeah, but one second, didn't we learn in a Mishnah that you should not, just become part of a group on Yom Tiv? And I guess the same would apply over here. Like, we wouldn't want you to become part of the group on that on that Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach. So Shani Yacha came to Ragel Etzlo command Imne Beimei Karadami. So the Gemara says, yeah, but this is different because Reuven would always be part of Shimon's group, and therefore Shimon was kind of expecting that Reuven was going to come. So he was kilu, it was as if he was already part of them from beforehand. V'atani Rab Hoshaya, but what about what Rab Hoshaya taught? Holech Adam Eitzel Roa Aragel Etzlo, that a person is allowed to go to a shepherd who he has a relationship with, and the shepherd can give him a sheep for his korban pesach, and then he can be makdish the sheep, right? Reuven goes to his shepherd. He says, "Hey, buddy, pal, can you give me a sheep for my korban pesach?" And sure enough, the shepherd gives it to him, and he's makdish the sheep. So we should say that is a support for Rabbi Yochanan, who says that you can be makdish a korban pesach on Shabbos. V'yotzebo, and you can be yotze with that sheep. Hasamnami came in the ragel etzla akdusha lemeikara. So no. The Gemara answers again. Since Reuven goes to this shepherd all the time, the shepherd was already makdish the animal from beforehand. Makdish katani, but it says that Reuven is going to be makdish the animal. Hekdish ilui midrabanan. No, it doesn't mean that he's going to be makdish the animal. The shepherd was already makdish the animal to be a korban pesach. It's better if the owner also is makdish the korban pesach as well, but he wasn't really doing the hekdish. The shepherd did, and it's not necessarily proof for Rabbi Yochanan, who says that you're allowed to be makdish a korban pesach on Shabbos. Umiyam Rabbi Yochanan hachi. Where do Rabbi Yochanan really say that you're allowed to be makdish a korban pesach on Shabbos? Ve'amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam Mishnah. Of course, we know that Rabbi Yochanan says that the halacha is like an unauthored Mishnah, a stam Mishnah, an unattributed Mishnah. Tanaan, and we have a stam Mishnah that says lo makdishim v'lo marichim v'lo machrimin. We don't set aside a korban. We don't say, hey, the value of this fellow I'm going to give to the Beis Hamikdash, and we don't say that this object I'm donating to the Beis Hamikdash. V'lo makbin trumas u'maisris, and we don't separate truma and maisris. Kol elu b'yom tiv amukavachom b'Shabbos. We don't do this on Yom Tiv, and certainly not on Shabbos. So we see that we're not makdishin on Shabbos. So lo kasha kan b'chovish kavua lenzman, kan b'chovish en kavua lenzman. So my answer is it depends. If it's something that there's a set time, such as korban pesach, it's erev Pesach. You have to do it now. If you miss it, you're chayiv kares. Well, then you'd be allowed to be makdish to korban pesach. However, if it's something that doesn't have a set time, you just want to say, oh, I'm going to be makdish an animal, I'll bring it at some point to the Beis Hamikdash, you wouldn't do that on Shabbos. Fine, set aside the korban pesach on Shabbos would be okay. Okay, I made it through the daf. I hope that I made it through the daf in a way that was understandable, but all this light is shining on me, which sounds really nice, but it isn't. Okay, let's do a recap. Okay, so the Gemara started out, Rav Chana of Baghdad said in the name of Shmuel that you are allowed to set a broken limb on Shabbos. Okay, we talked about loaning bread, which was very interesting. That we say if there's a fixed price for bread, so then you can loan because we're not concerned about interest of the prices fluctuating. But if there's no fixed price, well then what you should do is at the time of the loan, you should say, wait, how much does bread cost right now? $1? Okay, so I'll return $1 to you. And that way they know that, whatever is returned, there won't be any issues of interest. We talked about, can you make a loan on Yom Tiv or not? Rav Yosef said, you cannot collect a loan that was made on Yom Tiv. Rabbah says that you can collect a loan that was made on Yom Tiv, and we had all sorts of proofs to try to go either way. Some are more complex than others, but that is the machlok between Rabbah and Rav Yosef. We didn't succeed to, disprove either one of them. Then at the very end, we talked about being makdish an animal on Yom Tiv or on Shabbos. So we said that there's a distinction. If there is a set time that this animal needs to be offered, well then you can be makdish it on Shabbos. But if there's no set time, well then you shouldn't be makdish on Shabbos. You should just wait till after Shabbos. Friends, I hope you enjoyed that. Have a great day or night or whatever. Peace.